A historic day that will go down, I think, across the U.S. when it comes to really putting up a fight. And this honestly might just be the beginning of the fight.
Mr. President.
The senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you. We're about to hold a vote under the Congressional Review Act. The CRA was passed in 1994 to give Congress a 6-month window of 60 legislative days to review an agency rule. And if Congress doesn't like that rule, 60 days to overturn it. However, our vote today is not a vote on a notice and comment rule. In fact, our vote today is on something that doesn't even have the force of law. Our vote today is on a Staff Accounting Bulletin issued by the SEC back in the spring of 2022. Now, the SEC has issued these bulletins, they're called SABs, for nearly 50 years without anyone ever suggesting that they were subject to the CRA. The CRA has a time limit for a reason, so that settled law is settled law, something that everyone can count on. And the CRA is limited to agency rules so that a single member of Congress can't tie up agencies and Congress with expedited procedures under the CRA by raking over the details of every agency action. Today's vote, coming more than 2 years after the SEC wrote the bulletin and applying to a staff bulletin rather than a rule, is far outside the scope of the CRA. We should not be holding this vote, and all by itself, that is a good enough reason to vote no. But let's talk about the substance of this SAB for just a minute. Fairness of our markets depends on transparency. Investors in pension funds and 401ks and workers who are trying to save for retirement all have a right to know what they are investing in. Securities and Exchange Commission is the guardian of those financial disclosures that give investors information about a company's business plan, about its leadership, and about the risks that it faces in the market. So to help public companies disclose information about their business in a consistent way from one business to another so that investors can make comparisons, the SEC issues Staff Accounting Bulletins, these SABs, to clarify guidance about emerging issues in the accounting industry, how to tell people about this business. SAB number 121 was published to provide accounting guidance to companies that hold customers' digital assets. It says that because of some of the unique technological and legal risks associated with digital assets, public companies that safeguard crypto assets for their customers should make the risks associated with holding those assets visible to investors. One way that this risk shows up is that if a company safeguards property for someone, just an ordinary company is holding property for someone like stocks or bonds or jewelry, the company bears the risk that the property could be stolen. And that is why companies that hold property for others carry insurance, and it's why they have really big safes. But if the company safeguards crypto, there is a special risk that's not there with other kinds of property. Crypto can get hacked. In fact, there have been some pretty major crypto hacks in which assets just vanish. The risk isn't theoretical, it is real. FTX, $600 million, poof. Binance, $586 million, poof. Rosen Network, $625 million, poof. And Poly Network, $611 million, poof. All in just the last 3 years. We have seen multiple hacks of crypto platforms. The unique risks of crypto can create liabilities that seriously impact a company's financial condition. SAB 121 simply clarifies how companies should account for those risks in their financial disclosures. That's all it's doing. Now, there's a second kind of problem with crypto, and that is if a company safeguards property for someone, stocks, bonds, jewelry, like we talked about earlier, if the company doing the safeguarding goes bankrupt, the true owner of the stocks or the bonds or the jewelry can get their property back. But if the company that goes bankrupt is holding crypto, the peculiarities of crypto ownership and possession mean that the creditors of the bankrupt company could keep the crypto. The true owner may just be out of luck. Once again, SAB 121 simply clarifies how companies should make clear those risks in their disclosures. So let's talk for just a minute about what SAB 121 doesn't do. It doesn't bring customers' crypto assets onto a crypto platform's balance sheet or make the platform the owner of a customer's digital assets. Instead, SAB 121 requires disclosure of what other substantive laws, including bankruptcy laws, are already doing. This effort to reverse the SEC's accounting guidance would deprive investors of accurate information on the risks of holding crypto assets and corrode public trust in our financial system and our institutions. The vote today is about ensuring that the SEC is able to issue guidance that will help companies of all sizes produce strong, consistent, timely, and meaningful accounting disclosures. It's about protecting critical informational tools that investors and companies have relied on for half a century. And it's about maintaining the integrity of our markets, which relies on a clear, consistent accounting rulebook. Democrats should stand with President Biden against this effort to attack the SEC's authority. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak in favor of my Congressional Review Act resolution, Senate Joint Resolution 59, and its House companion, House Joint Resolution 109, a joint resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 U.S. Code of the rule submitted by the Securities and Exchange Commission relating to Staff Accounting Bulletin number 121. Staff Accounting Bulletin 121, or SAB 121, is a rule under the Administrative Procedure Act, disguised as an accounting guidance. It was published by the SEC staff without the approval of the majority of the commission. Accounting guidance is not something that normally would catch the attention of Congress. But in this case, a bipartisan group in the Senate and House has uncovered serious concerns with SAB 121 and the actions of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Nearly 2 years ago, I started this process by sending a request for a legal opinion on SAB 121 to the Government Accountability Office. That office found that SAB 121 is, in fact, a rule and subject to the Congressional Review Office. Shortly after this finding, I introduced the Senate resolution to overturn this guidance in the Senate, and Congressmen Mike Flood and Wiley Nichols introduced the House companion. I congratulate them and House Financial Services Chair Patrick McHenry on the strong bipartisan passage of this resolution in the House. Staff Accounting Bulletin 121 puts consumers at risk By requiring a covered institution to place consumer assets on its balance sheet, it gives creditors a way to claim those assets in the event of a bankruptcy. We have seen how this plays out for consumers. Their assets are frozen for months or even years while the bankruptcy plays out. In some cases, they lose their assets entirely. Now, they've entrusted these assets to the custodian. It is the custodian that is in bankruptcy, and yet their assets are the assets that are at risk. So this does not protect consumers at all. Under SAB 121, the ownership of more than $100 trillion in assets placed for safekeeping with America's custodians are in jeopardy. The safest place for digital assets is in a self-hosted wallet, but not everyone can custody their own digital assets, including institutional investors that the SEC requires to use a qualified custodian. Regardless of what each senator thinks about digital assets, they should want consumers and institutional investors to have the option of placing their assets in the safekeeping of prudentially regulated institutions. Unfortunately, Staff Accounting Bulletin 121 prevents this by placing customer assets on the balance sheet of the custodian. SAB 121 also means that capital requirements apply. Banks would have to hold as much as $1 of capital for every dollar of customer assets. As much as the SEC would have you believe otherwise, the bank regulators have no discretion on this point. Banks must follow U.S. generally accepted accounting principles when calculating capital requirements. Finally, SAB 121 demonstrates how the SEC will push forward its regulatory agenda at the cost of transparency and the stakeholder input that is required by law. The Senate could have avoided this if SEC Chair Gary Gensler was willing to direct staff to revise Accounting Bulletin 121 to keep customer digital assets off the balance sheets of custodians and engage in a transparent process. Refusing to revisit this policy after bipartisan criticism is odd. The majority of the SEC staff accounting bulletins from the last 30 years have been revisions and rescissions of prior guidance. Revisiting and fixing accounting standards, especially when there's a new technology, is warranted and encouraged. Guidance is meant to be flexible. It is not meant to set policy, which would require notice and comment by those that will be regulated pursuant to that regulatory process. But apparently, Chairman Gensler would rather politicize accounting standards to achieve policy goals in the banking industry, an industry I'd like to remind him he does not regulate, rather than conduct a transparent policy-making process. Maybe it's because Chairman Gensler knows that putting customer assets on the balance sheet is bad policy that would garner enough support to finalize a rule, or rather would not garner enough support to finalize a rule. Maybe it's because he's committed to an ill-informed and unworkable fight against the digital asset industry at any cost. Unfortunately, SAB 121 does nothing to protect consumers, nothing to protect consumers. It hurts them. I hope that all of my colleagues will recognize this and join me in voting in support of House Joint Resolution 109. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the joint resolution is considered read a third time. The question occurs on passage of the joint resolution.
All right, what we are seeing right now is a massive vote in the Senate.
Mr. Langford, aye.
As we're continuing to watch the vote stream in, but enough crossing that threshold for it to be a decisive
Mr. Mullen.
win.
Mr. Mullen, aye.
All right, Langford and Mullen, those are two more ayes to rebuke the SEC. Two more Republican votes there. It was all about watching the Democrats and which way the Democrats were going to vote. These are some high-powered Democrats who have broken with the Gensler, Biden, Warren anti-crypto alliance. You got Senator Tester from Montana. Huge voice in the Senate, one of the most powerful Democrats out there. Senator Gillibrand's been pretty pro-crypto for a while in her alliance with Senator Lummis on the Republican side as they've tried to change some laws. But there are other senators that I did not expect to really side with this Republican push. So many people had made that crypto was going to be a partisan issue here, but it's tough to call it a partisan issue when you have, I don't know, by my count at this point, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 Democrats breaking with that Gensler alliance to say, no, we cannot have this Staff Accounting Bulletin 121 in effect anymore. Some of the context around this, shout out to Perianne Boring, who called it to our attention when she came on Coinage back in February, calling out SAB 121 as something that would make crypto in the U.S. basically unworkable. It requires a lot of custodians to hold in reserves basically one for one.
Ms. Cortez Masto, no.
Cortez Masto, another Democrat joining the nays on this one. When we dig into why it matters, though, is because companies would need to hold one for one basically reserves in what they hold in custody. So if you have $1 million in crypto, you're going to hold $1 million in cash against it, which obviously makes it pretty difficult to custodian anything. And banks have also gotten quite angry that they can't get in on the action that BlackRock, Fidelity, all these other Bitcoin ETF issuers have been able to get in on. Not the case for banks. So maybe potentially explaining why some of these other high-powered Democrats have sided with the majority of Republicans here in voting down SAB 121. You have Cory Booker, a man who once attacked me on Twitter, joining Republicans in all this as well. So I don't know. It's kind of a massive vote. Again, there have been massive pushes from people who are in crypto to make sure this vote went this way. As we await Chuck Schumer's vote. Chuck Schumer, by the way, an aye as well. So also breaking with the Gensler-Warren Biden alliance by voting there. Again, potentially, perhaps because of Senator Gillibrand's influence in the state of New York as well there. But obviously, it would be required of me to bring up the fact that President Biden had already come out when this passed the House and said that he would veto this bill to repeal SAB 121. So we're going to see if he's going to follow through on that. And I think that the reason why it's so huge is that the press coverage of that really would draw the line in the sand between President Trump, who's come out and basically said he's good with crypto, as strong of an endorsement we've seen from a presidential candidate thus far. And it would really force the issue, I think, for President Biden to draw his stance in what his views are on crypto if he does, in fact, follow through with his threat to veto this. But a huge vote here in the Senate today. We'd already seen from the House passing this again with bipartisan support. Not a huge amount of Democratic support in the House vote. I think it was something about 21 Democrats. Here in the Senate, though, a much stronger rebuke of the anti-crypto views that we've seen from politicians in the U.S. This is a big day. This is a big day, Texas, as we watch this vote play out. I don't know how any other way you could describe this vote other than moving the ball forward for a lot of effort that's gone into making sure politicians are aware of what's going on in D.C. when it comes to hamstringing this industry again and again and again, not just via the SEC, of course, that's what this vote is about, but all kinds of other rules that exist out there that make it very hard. And I say this as a founder running a crypto media company in the U.S., very difficult to even run your business in this country So I think that's why so many people have been tuning in to watch this vote and see this all play out. Again, right now, as it stands, 58-37, the vote, according to the Senate's unofficial tally here, in Resolution 109 to disapprove of SAB 121, a historic day that will go down, I think, across the U.S. when it comes to really putting up a fight. And this honestly might just be the beginning of the fight, to be quite frank, seeing as President Biden most likely will come out and veto this. So it's important, I think, for everybody to bring this to the public's attention in really highlighting why this matters, because it's rare to see Republicans and Democrats come together in an election year to get something like this done. Does that mean that there's hope, by the way, for more crypto legislation to come through before we hit the election? I don't know. That kind of has me thinking about things in a different way. Does that also mean, by the way, that if
Mr. Cruz,
we see the Ethereum
Mr.
ETF...
Cruz, aye.
As Senator Cruz joins the ayes, perhaps not surprising there. If we see this pressure mount, you could maybe, I don't know if there's enough time. I think everyone at this point says that the Ethereum ETF is not going to get approved by the deadline in late May, only a couple weeks away from that, but certainly increases the pressure, certainly gets a lot of people maybe more excited when it comes to a potential lawsuit that might have to happen to get an Ethereum ETF approved. But people are waking up. I do want to raise the point here that clearly people are waking up to what's going on in DC and around the country. I think, as we've also highlighted on Coinage.media with our last interview with Perry Ann Boring, there's a lot of other races to pay attention to outside of just Trump v. Biden. There are some state races, by the way, and perhaps we should highlight all of the others who actually were in the no camp here. Unsurprisingly, obviously, Senator Elizabeth Warren is in the no camp on this resolution to repeal SAB 121. That's not a surprise, and perhaps not surprising to see a lot of Democrats joining her in that side as well. But in those state races, as we're seeing them shape up, there are some pretty key elections at the state level that become quite important, clearly, as we're seeing play out in this vote. This is kind of where a lot of these battles are going to head. It's going to be state representatives that might be shaping this, not just at, who runs the SEC, which of course, perhaps, as we've chatted with Commissioner Peirce before on Coinage, she might be the head of the SEC if Trump comes into office, depending on how things shake out. And everything else at the state level should not be overlooked. So we'll just raise that as well. But Texas, the vote tally, clearly in favor of repealing 121, 59-37 at this point. We've been covering this vote since the very beginning in our live stream. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in to watch this along with us as history is being made, as a pro-crypto army, dare I say, has formed in Washington, D.C. after years of people shitting on the industry, getting things wrong left and right. I think we've covered so many House and Senate hearings of just pure bullshit being thrown around when it comes to crypto and what this technology unlocks. Refreshing to see perhaps the other side forming as people try and get this right. So exciting as we see the tally come to a close, and continuing to dig in here on kind of why all of this matters. I think Perry Ann Boring, by the way, is just off of her D.C. The Digital Chamber was just hosting a conference down in Washington, D.C. yesterday and today, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm sure she's watching, chewing the popcorn right now. Caitlin Long DMing us right now as well. Chuck Schumer, in fact, did. If you're watching this, Caitlin, right now, Chuck Schumer did join the yays, which is a huge piece of this that might be overlooked in how many high-powered Democrats. If you're just joining the stream right now, I will list them again because I think it takes huevos.
Mr. Durbin.
Dick Durbin.
No.
He's going to be a no. We've covered before why Dick Durbin is perhaps one of the worst anti-crypto senators out there. He took money from FTX, didn't even realize it, by the way, and got called out by a reporter. That was a tough look for Senator Dick Durbin. But yes, Chuck Schumer siding with the yays, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure, Texas, we both watched that happen. As a New York senator, of course, this rule not strictly just impacting crypto companies themselves, it's a custodian rule, but the banks, obviously not surprising, a lot of banks in New York, very upset that they can't get involved in the Bitcoin ETF or custodian party. So this would change that. Again, President Biden set to veto this bill, as he's warned, if it passes, so potentially not actually getting to the level of changing anything. But that's just in practice. I don't want to overlook the political ramifications of a vote like this, because again, in an election year, it is now forcing President Biden to make a move and to draw his line in the sand. And if it is to veto a bill that attracted support from 21 Democrats in the House, and now potentially, as we tally them up, I think more than 10 Democrats in the Senate, that's a tough line to draw in an industry that is now growing quite quickly. That would be President Biden's move, and that would be one that he would be making to his own detriment. And so I think it's exciting to see this play out, whether or not this bill actually gets, approved by President Biden or vetoed by President Biden. Nonetheless, I want to just take a second to highlight all of the effort that went into this. And right now, where we're seeing at the state level, where everyone's voices and I guess, where they lie on this issue, because it's quite important. I wish there was a way, by the way, Texas, to just invite people to join us into this stream, which I don't know if we can add a guest or not. That would be throwing you a curveball that we haven't really done before. So hit us up in the comments if you want to pop on. If you're watching this right now, as we have been covering this all day, if you're saying, hey, Zach, I've got something to add, that's kind of why Coinage is here. As a community-owned Web3 outlet,
Mr. McConnell.
our NFT holders can co-own this with
Mr.
us.
McConnell. Aye.
Senator McConnell now joining the ayes as well. Perhaps, again, not surprising as we've seen the Republicans lead this charge. Now 60-38, so only basically in the final innings here. I do wonder if we are going to see more people step to the mic. Before we started this vote, Senator Warren came out again trying to explain why she holds her position and why she wants SAB 121 to stay in effect, trying to make the case that there have been a lot of hacks in crypto, that there are still risks, that you should hold some things to back up these assets as an insurance policy. We then heard from Senator Lummis on the other side explaining why this is not just an accounting rule kind of, rule put into effect to give guidance to companies, but rather one to hinder people who are trying to actually operate in this space. So kind of interesting to hear both of their speeches ahead of the vote. And again, shout out to Senator Lummis and all the work that she's done in kind of leading this charge. But if you are tuning in to us just now, the unofficial tally, 60-38, an overwhelming vote, a
This
rebuke.
vote, the yeas are 60, the nays are 38. The resolution is adopted.
Well, there you go.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, the Judiciary, Kamala C. Thieler of South Dakota to be United States District Judge for the District of South Dakota.
All right, we've moved on from all the
There
business
will now
we
be
tuned
2
in
minutes
for.
of debate, equally divided.
We've tuned in. We've watched
Senator,
this together. We've
Mr.
seen
President, I
history
rise
play
today,
out.
along
We've
with my
seen
colleague from
Democrats
South Dakota,
break from the
Senator
ranks
Rounds,
again.
in
I think they
support of the
deserve their
nomination of
coverage in
distinguished
all
South
of this.
Dakotan Judge Kamala
Senator
Thieler,
Casey, Senator Tester,
who's been
Senator
nominated to fill a
Rosen, Senator
vacancy at the
Peters,
U.S.
Senator
District Court for the
Gillibrand,
District
Senator
of South
Hickenlooper
Dakota.
as
Judge
well.
Thieler is a
Senator
South Dakota
Booker,
native
a
and a graduate
surprise,
of
I
the
think,
University of
and
South Dakota
Senator
School of Law.
Rosen I already read as well.
She's been
Chuck
a judge
Schumer.
for the South Dakota.
Senator Schumer breaking from the ranks as well in joining the repeal of SAB 121. Guys, this has been pretty wild to watch. And I think as well, if you're Gary Gensler watching this all play out, you're basically now stuck in a checkmate mode ahead of the Ethereum ETF, which all in intents and purposes will be denied when it comes to the end of the month, as we've been covering. Hopes have been dwindling on that. I don't want to say I called it, but I did call it back in January that it probably wasn't going to happen after talking with Commissioner Peirce at the SEC in terms of how this was going to go. But if you're President Biden and Gary Gensler, you're kind of caught in a checkmate now, because now you need to show your hand in vetoing what had just passed the House and the Senate. And so there's a lot going on in all of this, whether or not this actually gets through past a Biden veto or not. But regardless, I do want to highlight all of this playing out in an election year. Once again, if you haven't yet, by the way, Texas, I might just bring up my NDI just to show some of these things as well on our site, because, I just saw Perry and Boring from the Digital Chamber down in Dubai. And again, we had highlighted some of these things. So much attention goes to the presidential election. So many state level elections don't get the coverage they deserve. But it was one thing that she highlighted, is that, look, all of this stuff does matter. And you just saw a vote exactly proving the point that these state level elections do quite matter. And it's going to take American voters showing up to really have their voices heard. We talked about this earlier on Monday on the show with Jackie Melinek. A lot of hate was given towards that Blockworks op-ed earlier this week around not being a one-issue voter. A lot of people in crypto weren't so happy with the idea of calling out one-issue voters, considering that this election might be the most important one in the existence of crypto. We've been covering that on our site, of course, in terms of why this matters. And SAB 121 is just one element of our coverage in kind of moving the needle and focusing in on this. Texas, I don't know if you're seeing my screen or not here, but we've got no, you're not. We've got other coverage and other stories at Coinage.media, of course, to go through all this. If there is no one, and we're going to be working on this, by the way, to figure out a more seamless way to invite guests on this show, hit us up. Hit us up in the DMs, hit us up in the chat, hit us up in the replies. Let us know part of the structure of what we've built at Coinage is being a DAO co-op. So our NFT holders can influence our coverage, tell us which guests to have on, which stories to chase, and importantly, join the DAO co-op to become co-owners of what we're building. We've got more than 7,000 NFT holders who are in this project with us. Shout out to Constitution DAO that really showed what you can do on the internet when you bring co-ownership to the forefront. And now here we are as a Web3 outlet that has a studio out in Brooklyn, New York. You can come out here, you can co-own it with us, join the DAO co-op, and as we get through the legal mumbo jumbo, hopefully at the end of the year, we'll be in a position to pay out dividends to our NFT holders as well. Some people said it couldn't be done, but go ahead and look up co-ops, baby. It's something that can happen here in the U.S., and we are determined to try and show everyone what it looks like. I think, based on the fact that we have now moved past SAB 21, I'm not entirely sure if there's much more to chat on today's show. So we might leave it there. I do want to give a shout out to our sponsors and raise the fact that you can now stake with us as well. Coinage and our partners at Dike have launched our own validators. You can go to Coinage.media to stake with us. Those proceeds go back into the DAO co-op to help us put out coverage like this, to help us put out shows to highlight what's happening in Congress. And we couldn't do it without your support. So I want to shout out our community. I want to shout out everyone who's scooped up a Coinage NFT. If you've joined this community-owned revolution, I think, Tejas, if we have our song queued up, it'd just be magical to play us out. If you haven't yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter for more, and head to Coinage.media for all the big headlines in Web3. Thank you for joining us. Celebrate the big win in D.C. today, folks. You don't get them often. That's going to do it for this coverage of the live Senate vote down in Washington, D.C. Thank you for tuning in and join us at Coinage.media. We'll see you soon.